Good afternoon, everyone. Quick story time, since you mentioned the Hurricane Hunter flight. So as Hurricane Ian was about to move into the Gulf of Mexico a couple of years ago, I had the idea. I've always wanted to go with the Hurricane Hunters. You kind of have to reach out to them in advance to set it up. They do take media, but being a good husband, before I set it up with them, I had to check with my wife, right? So I'm at work, and I text my wife, and I say, "Are you going to kill me if I try to set up a flight with the Hurricane Hunters?" And I promise you, I'm not making this up. Her reply was, "No, you're good, as long as you check on your insurance before you take that flight." I did, and I got the okay to go on that flight, and it was a heck of an experience. And by the way, boy, I'm glad I'm before Coach Kelly and not following him up. So thank you guys for having me today. So the title of my presentation might sound a little doom and gloom, right? 2024 hurricane season outlook, buckle your seatbelts. But I'm going to get into why we're kind of worried about things. But first off, are you prepared? Have you done this? Strapped down the house? Okay. Maybe that's not the best preparation, but let's get into why I do think we need to be prepared. First off, it's been a pretty active stretch in and around the Gulf of Mexico, especially since 2017. Now, the continental U.S. has had 7 major hurricane landfalls, Category 3, 4, and 5. None on the East Coast. They've all been here in the Gulf of Mexico, so it's been a busy stretch. Here's a better way of visualizing that, though. So this meteorologist with the Washington Post made a composite, took a satellite image from each of those storms, put them all together into one. And what you see, well, that's actually, I tell you about, it's not all 7, that's 6 of the 7, but 6 of the 7 were Category 4 or 5 at landfall. So not just major, but Category 4 or 5. And look at how just about, there's hardly any part of the Gulf Coast that's been untouched by Category 4 or 5 just in the last 7 or 8 years. So that's our first heads up, number one. All right, quiz time now with Steve. Does anybody think they know what state gets the most hurricane hits? Hear a lot of Florida, right? Which is right. That is, in the long term, Florida is the state that gets hit the most. But in the last 20 to 25 years, we've been running neck and neck with Florida here in Louisiana. You see how close it is. 14 for Florida, 13 for us. Woohoo! Yay! Go Tigers! But what's really interesting when you compare those numbers, how close they are, you look at how much coast Florida has versus us. 3.5 times as much coastline as we do. It really puts into perspective. It's been a bad run for us since 2020 to have that many hits. So I propose today, new motion. You guys, I thought you were going to go over this one at the beginning, but instead of Sportsman's Paradise, I thought we could maybe go with Hurricane's Paradise on the license plates from now on. Feels like we need to head that way. All right, so here's the key message today. You all saw Beryl a few weeks ago going to Texas, but really the meat of the season is still ahead of us. Here in Louisiana, about 2/3 of our hits have occurred historically in August and September, but certainly bleeds into October too, especially that first half. I mean, if you throw October in there, you're probably looking at something like 75%. So the majority of the season is still ahead of us here in Louisiana. Here's some more bad news for Louisiana, right? When you look at the costliest hurricanes on record for the United States, 5 of the top 10 have impacted the state in some form or fashion. Now, Harvey was much more a Texas storm, but there were some Louisiana impacts. Ike was more of a Texas storm. Andrew did his biggest monetary damage in Florida, but certainly hit Louisiana plenty hard, but you get the idea. We're on that list a lot. We're also on this list a lot. When you look at the top flood insurance payouts in the history of the program, which has been around since the 1970s, Louisiana's got 5, is involved in 5 of the top 10 on that list, including the 2016 flood. So everything else on there is a named tropical system. 2016 was not, but it is, to this day, the 6th largest flood insurance payout on record for the National Flood Insurance Program. And boy, talk about, Todd and I were talking about insurance in this state. That crisis is not hyperbole right now. I think we've got a crisis in the state when it comes to insurance. All right, so let's get into the outlook for this season. An average season in the Atlantic is something like 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, 3 majors. Again, the majors, I think most of you know, the category 3s, 4s, and 5s. So Colorado State is the group that's been doing this the longest, starting in the 1980s with a man named Dr. Bill Gray. It's now been taken over by one of his students, Dr. Phil Klotzbach. They updated their numbers a week or so ago. They've been going with big numbers all along, but they increased them even more. And it's a forecast this big. They've never issued a forecast with numbers this big before. So 25 named storms, 12 hurricanes, 6 majors. That does include the 3 named storms we've had, the 1 hurricane and Beryl. But still, that would mean there's a lot to come if they're anywhere close to right. And then NOAA, basically the parent agency of the National Weather Service, has similar numbers, maybe a little bit lower, but still big numbers, and those are also record-setting numbers for NOAA. So why is everybody thinking this year is going to be so busy? Well, one thing is when we look at the ocean, there's a couple of things going on. First, on the Pacific side, you see where I drew that box? We think we're headed into what's called La Nina. And in real simple terms, while that's a Pacific phenomenon, what happens with La Nina when that develops is we tend to see wind shear reduced in the Atlantic. Hurricanes don't like wind shear. Wind shear, good for us. We want wind shear. That tends to keep storm counts down. So when wind shear goes down, storm counts tend to go up. So that's one big factor. Secondly is as we zoom in more on the Atlantic, so this is a snapshot from yesterday, okay? So this is how sea surface temperatures, water temperatures compare to normal. Basically, orange and red is where things are warmer than normal. Basically the entire Atlantic, right? That's a crazy map. And so the forecasters tend to focus on what we call the main development region. It's kind of mostly what's in that black box. So in there, so far this summer, we've seen record and near record sea surface temperatures, water temperatures. So that's another big factor. We zoom in a little bit on the Gulf of Mexico. We're also in the orange and red. That's not a good sign, right? We're running warmer than normal here too. Now here's a little interesting note on the Gulf. I'm going to switch the map slightly. This was roughly about 2 weeks ago, a little more than 2 weeks ago. Notice that over the central and western Gulf, the white is basically near normal. The blues, the greens are below normal. What happened? Well, that was when Beryl moved through, stirred up the water. Temperatures for a while were running a little bit below normal, but within a couple of weeks, it's already rebounded, all right? So already starting to run warmer than normal again. So even when you get a storm moving through this time of year, summer in the Gulf of Mexico, water temperatures rebound pretty quickly. So how does Colorado State, in addition to realizing that A, we've got La Nina probably developing, and B, the water is like a bathtub out there right now. How do they come up with their numbers? Well, they look at something called analog seasons. And in simple terms, what they're doing is they look at the conditions in the Atlantic right now, in July, and say, what years in the past look most similar to what we're seeing right now? And then they look at some products we can kind of examine and look at and say, what is forecast this year for the heart of the season, August, September, and October, and what years does that best compare to in the past? So here's and for Paul, this is for you, because Paul, you told me what?
I don't believe it's going to be as bad as you say it.
You heard it from Paul, all right? So I don't know if we're going to get wallets out and start laying money down. And Paul and I are both Brother Martin guys. We got that connection. So we got a little showdown with Paul and I. I'm going to tell you why, though. I'm a little bit nervous, maybe not quite as confident as Paul. So the analog seasons that the group at Colorado State picked, if you can make out those numbers at the top right, 1886, 1926, 1933, 1995, 2005, 2010, 2020. That's when we combine all those years on one map, that's what I come up with. It's a lot of storms. And if you average it out, you come up with 20 nameable storms. Why do I say nameable instead of named? Well, we started naming the storms around 1950. So we have some years in there before 1950 we didn't have names. But 20 named storms, if you will, 12 hurricanes, 6 majors on average. Those are big numbers when you average all those seasons together. So another thing is Beryl, all right? So this is a loop of Hurricane Beryl from its entire life cycle. Set all kinds of records. I've only got some of them up there. Earliest Category 4 on record, earliest Category 5 on record, earliest June hurricane, strongest June hurricane, strongest July hurricane, the easternmost that we've seen a hurricane form in the month of June. So all that was pretty bad. We saw what happened in Texas, even though it was, quote, and meteorologists hate this, only a Category 1. Colorado State, though, notes with regards to Beryl, they used this phrasing. I'm not just making this up. They said, Beryl is likely a harbinger of a hyperactive season or a really busy season. Because when they look back in the history books and we look at early season activity, typically the season getting off to a quick start doesn't necessarily mean the rest of the season is going to be really crazy. However, the difference with Beryl was it formed way out in the Atlantic. It got really strong, really far east. And they say when they look back through the books, the examples where we have seen storms form that far east and get strong this early on, those years usually do end up very busy, all right? So that's another red flag. So now what I wanted to do quickly is run through some of those analog seasons, what they look like in a little more detail, the ones that Colorado State is leaning on heavily for their forecast. 2020 is a year that it's kind of hard to forget in terms of hurricanes. The most named storms on record, we had 30 named storms that year, and there were a number of impacts in Louisiana, which we'll come back to in a moment. Now contrast that, 2010, it was a busy season, third most hurricanes on record, but most of the activity that year was focused over the open Atlantic, so that's a slightly encouraging sign, right? But as we start going through the rest of these analogs, the signs are not so encouraging. 2005, we can't forget that one, Louisiana, right, between Katrina and Rita, and there's a third forgotten hurricane that hit the state that year, Cindy, that came in closer to New Orleans in the month of July. 1995, for meteorologists, this is a year we kind of remember, those of us old enough, I guess. This really kind of marked the beginning of when the Atlantic hit a more active stretch that continues till today. Now, there's research that shows the Atlantic goes through these multi-decadal oscillations. In other words, the Atlantic tends to be more busy, more active for 4, 5, 6 decades, and then it might hit a stretch of 3, 4, 5, 6 decades where it's quieter. So as a kid my age, growing up in the 80s, it was relatively quiet. And then it was kind of like we flipped the switch around 1995. And then we can go way back, 1933, crazy season. So one thing to keep in mind with these last few analogs, these seasons were probably undercounted because we didn't have the technology we have now, probably more storms over the open Atlantic. Most ACE on record in 33, what's that? It's called accumulated cyclone energy. Basically, it's a way we say if we measure how long a storm is around, how strong it gets, there's a metric that we can use. And 1933 still stands as having the most ACE on record. So another crazy one. 26, 6 major hurricanes, which is a big year. And even in 1886, 10 hurricanes, 4 majors. Those are big numbers. So Paul, do you see why I'm nervous now? All right. So all of those things are a little bit, kind of not so positive when we look at it. If we zoom in on the Gulf of Mexico now, made a map, and combined all those seasons, and if you average it out, those seasons average per season 9 named storms in the Gulf, 5 hurricanes in the Gulf, and 2 major hurricanes. So that's a lot too. Now, we have actually, you might have missed it. I know everybody knows about Beryl. We've actually had 3 named storms in the southern Gulf already this year when you include Beryl. The other 2 went into Mexico, weren't a big deal for the most part. But even if you count those 3, if history's right, We're only about a third of the way in our Gulf of Mexico activity. And then if we zoom it in on Louisiana, so 7 analog seasons they chose. You combine those. This is not an average now. These are just totals. But you end up, we were impacted by 12 named storms, 9 hurricanes, and 6 majors. So in other words, if you look at that, 7 seasons, that's about 2 named storms per season impacting the state, better than 1 hurricane and about 1 major. So again, that's why I'm a little bit nervous about the season. That's not to say this is written in stone or a guarantee, but I'm showing you the red flags that we're seeing, right? So that's where a lot of our concern comes from. All right, before I get to questions, because I do want to save some time for questions, I did want to hit on one other thing today. I think it's one of the most misunderstood things when it comes to hurricanes. That would be the cone and how it works. A lot of people think the cone kind of represents our forecast confidence, storm to storm. So just to run through this quickly, and we use Hurricane Ida as an example from 2021, very first advisory. So the first thing it's done, I know it's probably a little hard to see, but the National Hurricane Center, they examine all the data, and they make a point forecast for each point in time, 24 hours out, 48, 72, and so on. Once they have those points, now they start drawing these circles. That's where it gets a little complicated. Hang with me. The circles are designed to capture about 2/3 of the average error over the last 5 years, all right? So it's their way of kind of saying this is our best estimate of where a storm might track, but 1/3 of the time it's going to track, historically, 1/3 of the time it's going to track outside of that cone. Once they draw the circles, then you connect the outer edges and we get that cone that we're all familiar with. But the key point with the cone is that storm to storm in a given season, the size of it does not change. So hopefully this slide will make a little more sense of that. 2 storms from 2017. On the left side is Irma. On the right side is Harvey. So Irma kind of looks like a normal cone. Harvey, you get that big circle, right? Blob. And so people often interpret that to mean, oh, they drew it that big because they don't know where it's going. No, it's just that the way the cone is constructed, when a storm is stalling or not moving, you start stacking those circles one on top of each other, you can end up with a blob. But the cone size, storm to storm, does not change, okay? So remember that. It says nothing about forecast confidence for that specific storm. Now, hurricane forecasts have generally gotten really good. It's honestly, it's one of the most remarkable improvements we've seen in weather in recent decades. However, so this graphic compares the cone size now through the years, because remember, the cone, each year they recalculate what was the average error over the last 5 years, they make a new one. So in 2004, it's a lot bigger. And you see it's gotten a lot smaller now. That's evidence of how the forecasts have gotten better. But this year, for the first time in a while, the cone is actually a little bit bigger than it's been in recent years. And what that tells us is last year was not quite as good for hurricane forecasts in the Hurricane Center. So it's actually gotten slightly bigger this year than it had been in recent years. All right, so having said that, I told you hurricane forecasts are great, and then I told you, well, maybe not so much, and that's why, I lied to you. You can't trust the media, right? Everybody knows you can't trust the media. So this is one of my favorite clips. Are you able to hit that? We might not even have sound on this, but I think you'll still get the impact. So I don't know if you can hear, and Matt Lauer's, he's had better days than in the recent times, but He said first, was there a big drop-off we couldn't see? Then he asked if there were holy men that were coming through there. So be careful with where you consume information. I like to think I'm trustworthy. In fact, I had a gentleman asking, do you think weather people these days hype things up more? I don't think we do. Everybody may have different feelings. I try to be even keel in how we deliver things. So with that, I am done and happy to take questions. I'm all over social media. If you want to find me, I'm there.
When Hurricane Ida was just south of Grand Isle, 24 hours before the eye hit the storm, it was a Category 1. By the time it hit Grand Isle and Leeville, where my camp used to be, it was a Category 5. Is there any science that justifies that rate of increasing? Because the change in the rate is humongous in that time frame.
Okay, so great question. I think everybody could probably hear that, but basically about the rapid intensification of Ida as it approached landfall in Louisiana. So the short and simple answer is they're still trying to figure that out. There's a lot of research focused on that, but no doubt one of the things that's been concerning for people like myself, meteorologists, emergency managers, is there have been more storms that seem to be intensifying right on up to landfall in the Gulf of Mexico in recent years. It was kind of evidence of that slide that I showed you toward the beginning with all those Category 4 and 5 storms. So we're trying to figure that out. One obvious part of the equation is the waters have been running warmer overall year by year in recent years. So this year, it's record warm, but I could go back a year or two and I could probably find the data and show you at that point it was record warm. So that's a big part of it. Now, in the big scheme of things, most of the research shows that, I know it's a hot button issue, but if we talk about climate change or global warming, it's unclear what the ultimate impacts are when it comes to tropical weather. There are some signs that warmer oceans will result in stronger storms, but there are also some signs that say climate change, global warming would modify the atmosphere in other ways. We get more wind shear on average that tends to bring the storm counts down. And so right now the information is kind of inconclusive there. But your point, that's one of my biggest concerns. We've seen more storms intensifying up to landfall in recent years.
I don't really have a question, more of a suggestion. Now that you're the new chief meteorologist, I know in the past Jay would roll his sleeves up and his deck out, so I knew, so I want to know what is going to be different. I'm watching and I see those sleeves rolled up.
So let this serve as fair warning for the remainder of the hurricane season. Jay's sleeves have become quite the thing, and we were actually working on a little promo with that recently with Jay getting ready to retire, so you might see something pop up soon.
So I have a question. You had the analog, the ACS storm thing, but there was no real pattern to the years that were selected. It wasn't like every 10 years or every something. How did they select those years for the?
Yeah, so what they look at is, number one, what did water temperatures look like in July in those years, and then what did water temperatures look like in August through October? So what years were the water temperatures in July most similar to what we see right now? Not just the values, but sort of the distribution of it. And then they look at parameters in the atmosphere too. So they match it up that way as best as can. And their technique has tended to work fairly well. There's been good years and bad years for the forecast, but overall it's proven to be, a pretty good method.
I have a question for you. Excuse me. Who decides the names for the hurricanes, and how do they decide that? I find it real interesting.
Sure. So there's a group called the World Meteorological Organization that meets once a year, and they go over the names. There's 6 lists of names that they've come up with that get rotated, so they get reused every 6 years. With the exception is if it's a really bad one, Katrina, Ida, on down the list, it'll get retired, get replaced. So that's one of their tasks is when a storm, first they have to vote on which ones get retired, and then they have to come up with the replacements for those names. It's quite the history there. They started out all female names, and actually that was through the late 70s, and then they mix it up, and there's all kinds of stuff to names. You can go down a rabbit hole with that.
With the coastal erosion for our state, is there a percentage or increase, and how much increase is Baton Rouge at risk to the hurricanes compared to 30 years ago when we had more coastline?
Yeah, so here in Baton Rouge, I'm not so worried about maybe the surge element, but you go a little bit south of here and you absolutely get surge involved, and that is a concern. If you want to see kind of the worst case scenarios when it comes to that, the National Hurricane Center actually has a website. If you Google like Hurricane Center, they're called MOMS, M-O-M-S, and MEOWS, M-E-O-W-S. They're acronyms. But it basically shows you kind of the worst case scenarios. So you can see kind of some of the scary stuff. But no, it's absolutely a concern. It's going to be an issue. As we lose coast, the water's going to move farther inland.
Dr. Steve, why do the hurricanes always go to the north and not to South America? And also, what's going on with the Sahara dust? How does that impact?
Yeah, so we look at, you think about, if you think about the atmosphere as basically a fluid, a river of air, it gets kind of stirred by, big areas of high pressure and low pressure in the atmosphere. So one thing that's a kind of a permanent, semi-permanent feature in the atmosphere is what we call the Bermuda High out over the Atlantic. It tends to be centered around Bermuda. It fluctuates east and west, but that hurricanes, tropical systems often kind of move around the periphery of the Bermuda High. That's one thing. Two, the Saharan dust. The Saharan dust does have impacts. I don't show it probably as much as some other people because I think the Saharan dust can often be overcome. In fact, when Beryl was developing, there was a good bit of Saharan dust out over the Atlantic. Those storms can sometimes isolate themselves even when there's surrounding conditions that aren't so great with the dust. It's become one of those things that gets a lot more attention now because we have better ways of tracking it with satellite and things like that. And it's not to say it's not an impact, but you won't probably hear me talk about it quite as much as some other people.
See, when you fly into a hurricane and you get past the eye wall, which is a turbulent, is it an immediate calm or is it a gradual calm? Is it like going from a gravel road onto a paved road, or what is the transition?
It was pretty fast. So in our flight, what they do is they fly an alpha pattern, like the Greek letter alpha. And we went through the eye 5 times, which means you pass through the eye wall 10 times. So it's a long flight. And as you're going through the eye wall, you're really bouncing around. And then, when you hit the eye, it goes, especially if it's a well-developed hurricane like Ian was when we went. It was Category 2 on the cusp of Category 3. It got stronger even after we left, but it had a pretty well-developed eye, and so, it was pretty quick.
Steve, you mentioned that thing in the Pacific. Moving forward for the next 12 months, what can we expect here in Louisiana? Last year we had heat and dry. This year, hot and wet. Winter into next summer.
Yeah, so often when La Nina is around, I should say often, it's a little more of so the signal is more pronounced in Louisiana with El Nino than it is with La Nina. When we have El Nino around, which is sort of the opposite of La Nina, we can almost be assured of a wet winter. La Nina, the results are a little more mixed through history. Tends to be a little bit drier, but not always.
What's causing the apparent slowing down of the hurricanes as they come to land? Because that brings all out flooding and heavy rains and so forth.
Yeah, it's hard to say if there's a long-term trend on that or not. We certainly saw that with a storm like Harvey that dumped up to 60 inches of rain, right? Some people have looked into a breakdown, the jet stream. You probably heard us talk about the jet stream. The jet stream kind of helps steer weather systems on big scale. And so There are some indications that we're seeing some changes in the jet stream where it gets locked into a pattern for a longer period of time, where basically it's not fluctuating as much as it would in the past. So if it's locked in a pattern where maybe it's way up north, there's nothing to really move that hurricane along, that can happen.
Simple question. How much is it gonna rain tomorrow?
Well, if you ask probably my good friends, maybe even some of my family, they would say, I would probably tell you it might not. We'll get some, a little bit. No, yeah, so we've got rain chances tomorrow, 70%, so I'd be ready for some more rain.
Are the hurricane wind speeds, are they staying as constant high numbers, or from year to year to year, are the wind speeds, are the velocities of the wind speeds, are they increasing?
All right,
Or
so
are they pretty much the norm over the years?
So to answer that question, are hurricane wind speeds changing? That's another one's kind of the mixed results. You know, we've seen this big uptick in the number of storms in the Atlantic in recent years, but if we count storms globally, it's been pretty much a flat line and maybe even a slight decrease globally. It just seems to be a bad run for the Atlantic. There are some indications, if you believe in climate change and the impacts of the warmer oceans, storms in general will be stronger, but there might be some offsetting factors that actually bring the storm counts down. So it's kind of a balancing act there. The storm counts might be balanced out a little bit by more wind shear, but the ones that do develop might have a tendency to be a little bit stronger than they have in the past, if that makes sense.
Last question.
All right, last question.
Which was a great segue into, my question was that you just mentioned was a good segue into it. So on global warming, it's been politicized for years. So as a meteorologist, where do you stand on causes of global warming?
So you want me to chicken out and tell you? I really am. If we were to put it in political terms, I guess I'm kind of a moderate. I believe in climate change. I don't believe in most of the doomsday scenarios you might hear. I do believe we should be taking some action to mitigate against it, but I also think humans have proven through time are pretty good at adaptation. For two things, I know we're out of time, but real quick on that point. As it relates to here in Louisiana, two things concern me. Number one, sea level rise. Sea level rise is a real thing, but when you combine that with the fact that Louisiana's coast is already sinking, subsiding due to the other factors, that's a real bad recipe. And number two, a warmer world, rain events are going to produce more rain, okay? So that's my other big concern, the two big concerns I have locally. Thank you all very much.